Outlaws feared them. History remembers them. Subscribe now for the Wild West's deadliest legends. The story of the Dalton Gang does not begin in a hail of bullets or with the reckless swagger of outlaw legends. It begins in the dust and grit of a struggling frontier family. A family that once sought stability in the raw American West, only to fall into infamy. The Dalton family roots. The Daltons were not born into crime. In fact, their roots were tangled up with the very law they would one day defy. Lewis and Adeline Dalton raised a large family in Missouri before pushing westward into the harsh territories of Kansas and Indian Territory. Like many pioneer families, they endured droughts, backbreaking labor, and the constant pressure of survival. Among the 15 Dalton children, several brothers stood out: Grattan, Grat, Robert, Bob, and Emmett. Another brother, Frank Dalton, would actually wear a badge as a deputy U.S. Marshal, a role that demanded courage in the face of rampant outlawry. For a time, it seemed the Dalton family might be remembered as protectors of law, not violators of it. But the West had a way of twisting fate. Frank Dalton's death and a turning point. Frank's death in 1887, gunned down in the line of duty while trying to arrest whiskey peddlers, shook the family deeply. For the younger brothers, Frank had been a symbol of honor, a living proof that Daltons could stand on the side of justice. His killing left a void, one that would soon be filled not with justice, but with vengeance, bitterness, and ambition. Bob and Grat attempted to follow Frank's path by serving as lawmen themselves. They worked briefly as deputies in Indian Territory carrying badges but often earning suspicion. Law enforcement on the frontier was a blurred profession, underpaid, poorly supplied, and rife with temptation. Deputies were expected to chase hardened criminals across hundreds of miles for little pay, while watching wealthy railroads and banks grow fat with gold. For ambitious men, the math didn't add up. From lawmen to outlaws. The slide into outlawry wasn't sudden, but it was steady. In 1890, rumors swirled that Bob and Grat Dalton had turned their skills toward crime, using their knowledge of marshals, routines, and territorial geography to rob rather than protect. Their first train robbery near Wharton in Indian Territory was almost comically amateur. They managed to stop the train but fumbled through the process of forcing the express car open, walking away with far less than they expected. Yet even in failure, the taste of outlaw life proved intoxicating. Bob, the most ambitious of the brothers, was restless and driven. He wanted more than just survival. He wanted fame, the kind of fame Jesse James had carved into the folklore of America. Grat, rougher and less imaginative, followed his younger brother's lead, and Emmett, still in his teens, idolized them both too much to resist. The rise of a gang. As their crimes escalated, the Dalton brothers began attracting followers. Outlaws on the run, disillusioned drifters, and reckless gun hands found in the Daltons a chance to make quick money and chase notoriety. The brothers became ringleaders, not just participants, shaping their gang into a small but dangerous unit. Their robberies grew bolder, trains ambushed under the moonlight, express cars dynamited open, guards intimidated or shot at. The Dalton gang learned from mistakes, refining their methods, moving quickly from town to town, and cultivating a reputation that unsettled railroad companies and local sheriffs alike. Still, their take was never enough to match their ambition. Railroads tightened security. Pinkerton detectives prowled the territories, and every lawman with a rifle longed to collect the bounty hanging over the Daltons' heads. The shadow of Jesse James. Bob Dalton, more than his brothers, seemed obsessed with eclipsing the legend of Jesse James. The James gang had captured the imagination of America, daring robberies, escapes under fire, and a final betrayal that cemented Jesse's myth. Bob wanted that kind of immortality. Not just money, but the kind of name that would be whispered in saloons long after he was gone. It was this hunger for legend that would plant the seed of the Coffeyville plan. But that fateful day was still ahead. Emmett Dalton's innocence. Lost Emmett's story provided a tragic contrast. At only 20 years old when the gang was most active, he was more boy than hardened criminal. Friends later remembered him as almost reluctant, someone drawn along by loyalty rather than greed. But loyalty to family is a double-edged blade. Emmett believed in his brothers, trusted their vision, and followed them even when the path veered toward doom. In time, Emmett would become the only Dalton brother to survive the disaster in Coffeyville. But for now, he was simply another rider, chasing dreams that weren't his own. The gang's growing infamy. By 1892, the Daltons had gained enough notoriety to attract headlines. Newspapers painted them as ruthless highwaymen. Train companies doubled their rewards and wanted posters bearing their likenesses multiplied across the territories. For lawmen, hunting the Daltons was both a duty and an opportunity for fame. For the brothers, it was a dangerous game of survival. Each robbery raised the stakes, forcing them to consider bolder moves to outshine the outlaws of the past. Foreshadowing the final ride. Looking back, the Dalton brothers' early years carried all the elements of a Greek tragedy. They were men born into hardship, seduced by the promise of outlaw glory, and doomed by their own ambition. The death of Frank Dalton had nudged them off the path of law. The dream of surpassing Jesse James had given them purpose. But it was pride, the fatal flaw of countless legends that would push them toward their last gamble. That gamble was Coffeyville. That gamble would make them famous forever, but not in the way they hoped. The plan in Coffeyville. On the surface, Coffeyville, Kansas, was the sort of place that didn't seem built for legend. Nestled in the rolling plains, it was a modest frontier town where merchants sold goods off creaking wooden porches and farmers rode in with wagons rattling full of grain. Yet, to the Dalton brothers, Coffeyville represented something more, a stage upon which they could carve their names into outlaw history. It wasn't just about money anymore. By the summer of 1892, the Dalton Gang had already robbed trains and frightened passengers, but none of their crimes had elevated them to the mythic pedestal they craved. The outlaw game was crowded with names like Jesse James and the Younger Brothers, legends whispered in every saloon. Bob Dalton wanted more than whispers. He wanted a roar. Why Coffeyville? Coffeyville was no random choice. The town held two banks within a single block, the C.M. Condon Bank and the First National Bank. Robbing one would be daring enough, but Bob envisioned something unprecedented, robbing both at the same time. The idea was pure outlaw theater. If successful, the Dalton Gang would go down in history as the men who accomplished the impossible, surpassing the James Younger Gang in one bold stroke. Bob was confident that stealing from two banks simultaneously would etch their names into the lore of the Wild West forever. Money was part of the equation, too. Train robberies had grown dangerous and unpredictable. Coffeyville's banks, on the other hand, held reliable wealth. Taking both would provide enough cash to flee south, perhaps even across the border, where fame would follow, but lawmen could not. The brothers' confidence. Bob Dalton radiated confidence as he laid out the plan. "We'll ride in, take both banks clean, and ride out before they even know what hit 'em," he declared. Great nodded in agreement, rough and steady, trusting his younger brother's vision. Emmett, though quieter, went along as he always did. His loyalty was a chain stronger than reason. The gang also included Bill Power and Dick Broadwell, both committed outlaws who had ridden with the brothers in earlier heists. Together, the five men envisioned themselves as a force no small Kansas town could resist. Preparation for glory. The Daltons planned meticulously, or so they believed. They scouted Coffeyville, noted the positions of the banks, the likely movements of townspeople, and even the back alleys they might use for escape. Their disguises, however, left something to be desired. In an attempt to mask their faces, they pulled on long coats and fake mustaches, thinking the townspeople wouldn't recognize them. But Coffeyville wasn't a sprawling city. It was a close-knit community. Everyone knew everyone. The Dalton brothers had lived nearby in earlier years. Too many eyes would catch too many details. Still, their ambition blinded them to this risk. Bob pressed on, intoxicated by the scale of his plan. The morning of October 5th, 1892. At dawn, Coffeyville stirred awake as usual. Merchants swept porches, women carried baskets to market, children darted in and out of the dusty streets. No one yet knew that history was bearing down upon them with the thunder of horses' hooves. The Dalton Gang rode in from the west, dust trailing behind them like a storm cloud. They tethered their horses in an alley near the banks, close to escape. Rifles were concealed beneath their coats, revolvers heavy at their sides. They split into two groups. Bob, Great, and Power would enter the Condon Bank. Emmett and Broadwell would handle the First National. To the brothers, everything seemed under control. They imagined themselves legends already, rehearsing the glory they believed would follow. The flaw in the plan. But Coffeyville was not asleep. The moment the gang strode down the street, townspeople noticed. Their disguises looked strange, their movements too deliberate. And then came recognition. That's Bob Dalton," whispered one man. Another muttered, "The Daltons are here." Within minutes, alarm spread. Coffeyville was not a town of cowards. Farmers, merchants, and shopkeepers had lived too long on the edge of the frontier not to know how to handle a rifle. As the gang split and entered the banks, citizens quietly armed themselves. Hardware store owners passed out ammunition. Shopkeepers pulled rifles from behind counters. The peaceful street was about to transform into a battlefield. The gang inside the banks. Inside the Condon Bank, Bob Dalton's voice rang sharp and commanding. "Hands up! This is a robbery." Customers froze. Clerks stared wide-eyed as rifles swept across the room. Bob demanded the vault be opened, shoving the teller forward with impatient urgency. At the same time, Emmett and Broadwell burst into the First National Bank. Emmett, nervous but resolute, forced the employees toward the safe while Broadwell covered the door. The gang believed the plan was unfolding just as intended. But outside, time was slipping away. The town arms itself. By now, Coffeyville's main street was bristling with rifles. Citizens crouched behind barrels, took aim from windows, and gathered in alleys. It wasn't lawmen who would challenge the Daltons first, but the townsfolk themselves. Ordinary men who refused to let their banks fall without a fight. The gang had walked into a trap of their own making. Their ambition had blinded them to the courage of a frontier community. Foreshadowing the storm. As the brothers gathered money inside the banks, a silence built outside. A silence heavy with expectation, broken only by the click of rifle bolts being drawn back and the pounding of hearts. The Daltons thought themselves predators, but they were already surrounded by prey-turned-hunters. What began as the boldest plan of their lives was about to collapse into chaos. The guns of Coffeyville were ready, and history itself held its breath. The heist begins. The clocks of Coffeyville ticked toward mid-morning on October 5th, 1892. For the Dalton brothers, every second felt like destiny unfolding. Inside the banks, the gang moved with rehearsed precision, unaware that outside the town was bristling with rifles and history was ready to shatter their illusions. Inside the Condon Bank, Bob Dalton stood tall in the CM. Condon Bank, his Colt revolver gleaming under the morning light. His voice cracked like a whip. "Fill the sack, gold, bills, everything, and do it fast." The clerks moved with trembling hands, their eyes darting toward the barred windows where sunlight spilled in, almost mocking their fear. Bob shoved the canvas bag across the counter, his finger tapping impatiently on the trigger guard. Grat, Dalton, and Bill Power kept their rifles trained on the room, scanning for any sign of resistance. "Don't be fools," Grat growled. "Stay quiet and no one gets hurt." But the employees hesitated at the vault. It was locked on a timer, they explained nervously, impossible to open in the moment. Bob's jaw tightened, frustration flashing in his eyes. Every wasted minute was a crack in their plan. Emmett at the First National Bank across the street, Emmett Dalton and Dick Broadwell pushed their way into the First National Bank. Emmett's youth showed in his nervous urgency. He waved his revolver at the cashier. "Open the safe, now." The cashier stammered that it couldn't be opened without a key, fumbling as he tried to explain the delay. Emmett pressed harder, shoving the barrel forward. The employees knew the townsfolk outside were stirring. Buying time was their only hope. Broadwell, posted by the doorway, peeked out into the street. His stomach tightened. He could see movement, men slipping behind barrels, rifles glinting in the sun. Broadwell whispered harshly to Emmett, "They know we're here. We don't have long." The streets grow, silent. Outside, Coffeyville's main street was no longer bustling with wagons and chatter. A tense silence cloaked the town. Farmers and shopkeepers crouched in doorways, rifles balanced on windowsills. The blacksmith clutched his shotgun. A hardware store owner passed ammunition to neighbors like it was bread at a feast. The Daltons thought they were hunters, but Coffeyville had become a trap. Its citizens transformed into a militia. From behind a rain barrel, a merchant whispered, "Wait till they come out. Wait." The alarm sounds. The first crack of defiance came not from the law, but from an ordinary citizen. A rifle shot rang out, sharp and shocking, echoing off wooden storefronts. The bullet splintered the doorframe of the Condon Bank. Bob Dalton spun, eyes wide. "They're on to us." In that instant, the heist stopped being a robbery and became a battle. Chaos at the Condon Bank. Grat Dalton rushed toward the entrance, firing a blast from his Winchester at the crowd forming outside. Splinters flew from a porch post as townsmen ducked for cover. Bill Power cursed under his breath, pumping his shotgun and firing blindly into the street. The response was immediate. Gunfire erupted from every direction, bullets shrieking through the dusty air. The Condon Bank became a fortress under siege, glass shattering, wood splintering as lead punched through the walls. Inside, customers screamed and dove to the floor. Bob cursed, realizing their supposed disguise had failed miserably. The First National Bank under fire. At the same moment, Emmett and Broadwell found themselves trapped in the First National Bank. The townsfolk had taken up positions across the street, firing volleys at the front windows. Bullets smashed through panes, showering the brothers with shards of glass. Emmett fired back, his revolver bucking in his hands. Broadwell tried to return shots with his Winchester, but the narrow door gave them no advantage. Every bullet seemed to whistle closer, every moment heavier with inevitability. "We have to move," Broadwell shouted. Emmett nodded, his youthful bravado cracking under the weight of chaos. A town becomes a battlefield. By now, Coffeyville sounded like a war zone. The air was thick with smoke and dust, the smell of gunpowder choking every breath. Horses whinnied in terror, tethered in the alley, straining against reins as bullets zipped past. Shop windows shattered. Wagon wheels splintered. A boy peered from behind a fence before his mother dragged him back to safety. The once quiet town square had transformed into something out of a nightmare, a battlefield painted by desperation. The Daltons had dreamed of applause, but they were met instead with a chorus of gunfire. The brothers' desperation. Inside the Condon Bank, Bob Dalton's fury boiled over. He hurled the half-filled sack aside. "Forget the money, we're getting out of here." Great and Power reloaded frantically. Their shoulders pressed against the wall as lead peppered the building. Bob peeked through a shattered window and saw rifles trained on them from every angle. Across the street, Emmett reached the same conclusion. "We can't hold here," he shouted to Broadwell. "We'll die in this bank." The plan to rob 2 banks in broad daylight had collapsed within minutes. The Daltons were no longer robbers. They were cornered men, fighting for their lives. Foreshadowing the final stand. As the gunfight raged, Coffeyville's citizens pressed closer, relentless in their defense of home and livelihood. The Daltons' every move narrowed their chances of escape. The brothers had come seeking glory to eclipse Jesse James in boldness. Instead, they had stumbled into a storm of their own making, a storm that Coffeyville AS rifles would not allow them to outrun. The heist was over. The massacre was about to begin. Coffeyville fights back gunfire rattled through Coffeyville like a summer storm, each crack of a rifle echoing off the false fronts of wooden buildings. For a town that had woken only hours before to a quiet October morning, Coffeyville was now drenched in chaos. The Dalton brothers had come to write themselves into legend, but it was the townsfolk who picked up the pen. Citizens rise. From every doorway, from every porch, men armed themselves with the tools of survival. Shotguns long used for hunting, rifles handed down through families, revolvers polished for self-defense. They were shopkeepers, farmers, clerks, and blacksmiths, ordinary people who, on this day, became defenders of their home. Charles Brown, owner of the hardware store, flung open his doors and began handing out boxes of ammunition. "Load up, boys," he shouted. "We'll send 'em to hell before they rob us blind." A grocer crouched by his store window, firing carefully at shadows moving inside the Condon Bank. A livery worker dragged a shotgun across the dirt street, crouching behind a wagon as bullets thudded into the wood. The Daltons had imagined townsfolk cowering in fear. Instead, they found themselves facing a militia of furious citizens, trapped in the banks. Inside the Condon Bank, Bob Dalton cursed as bullets sprayed the walls. Every window was shattered, the counters were chipped and pocked with lead. Great reloaded with shaking hands, his face slick with sweat. Bill Power groaned, already wounded in the arm by a round that had splintered through the door. Across the street, at the First National Bank, Emmett Dalton and Dick Broadwell huddled low as the front windows erupted with gunfire. Dust and glass hung in the air, thick as fog. Emmett's revolver smoked in his hand, but for every shot he fired, 3 came back. "They're not running," Emmett muttered. His voice cracked with disbelief. "The whole damn town is fighting." Broadwell's jaw was tight, his eyes darting to the alley where their horses were tied. Escape was close, but it might as well have been a mile away under the storm of lead. The first casualties. As townsfolk closed in, the first bodies began to fall. A young store clerk, too eager, rushed into the open with a rifle and was struck down instantly. His cry sent a jolt through the crowd, but it only hardened their resolve. "Don't waste him," shouted another citizen, leveling his rifle. "Take the bastards down." From the rooftop of the drugstore, 2 men fired volley after volley, pinning the gang inside the banks. From behind a hitching post, the blacksmith's shotgun boomed, peppering the front door of the Condon Bank. For the Daltons, every second felt like drowning. The tide was rising, and the town was merciless. A desperate break. Bob Dalton knew they couldn't sit inside forever. "We move, or we die here," he barked. Great nodded grimly, adjusting the brim of his hat. Bill Power, pale from blood loss, clutched his rifle with his good arm, determined to follow his leader. At nearly the same moment, Emmett yelled across the First National Bank, "Broadwell, we've got to make for the horses." The gang's plan had dissolved into raw survival. The streets turn. Red. The first attempt to break free came from the Condon Bank. Bob shoved the door open and fired wildly into the street. Great charged behind him, Winchester spitting fire. Bullets screamed back at them. Bill Power staggered through the doorway, only to be struck in the chest by a shotgun blast. He spun backward, collapsing into the dirt, his rifle clattering beside him. Across the street, Emmett and Broadwell burst from the First National Bank, crouching low and sprinting across open ground. Citizens fired from every direction. Broadwell cried out as a round tore into his side, stumbling but pushing forward toward the alley. Emmett's youthful determination carried him through, but his body was already peppered with wounds. Each step was agony, but loyalty and desperation drove him on. Coffeyville's unity. What made the stand remarkable wasn't just the courage of individuals. It was the unity of the town. Farmers and merchants fought shoulder to shoulder, calling warnings, covering one another, and advancing with measured determination. A schoolteacher, rifle steady in her hands, leaned from an upstairs window and shot at the fleeing gang. A saloon keeper tossed a revolver to a young man crouched by a barrel. It was no longer about money. It was about defending Coffeyville itself. The brothers fall. Great Dalton stumbled as a bullet tore through his chest. He dropped to his knees, gasping, firing one last desperate round before collapsing into the dust. Bob fought furiously, his revolver blazing until the cylinder clicked empty. He fell, moments later, riddled with bullets, his dream of outlaw glory bleeding into the dirt of Coffeyville's main street. Broadwell, mortally wounded, collapsed in the alley, groaning as life seeped away. Emmett, though shot multiple times, staggered toward the horses. He reached the reins, blood streaming down his coat before another volley struck him. He fell hard, but remarkably, he lived, his youth and sheer stubbornness carrying him through where others had fallen. Aftermath of the battle. When the smoke cleared, 4 gang members lay dead: Bob Dalton, Great Dalton, Bill Power, and Dick Broadwell. Emmett Dalton, riddled with more than 20 wounds, was barely clinging to life. Coffeyville itself had suffered dearly. 4 townsmen were killed, several more wounded. The streets looked like a war had passed through, littered with shattered glass, bullet casings, and the still forms of both citizens and outlaws. But Coffeyville had stood. The town had faced down one of the boldest outlaw gangs in the West, and won. The legend cemented. The Dalton Gang had sought immortality by robbing 2 banks at once. In a way, they achieved it. Their failure became legend, a tale retold across America as both warning and spectacle. But it was not the kind of glory Bob Dalton had envisioned. Instead of standing shoulder to shoulder with Jesse James and Myth, the Daltons were remembered as reckless men who overreached and paid the ultimate price. And in Coffeyville, the memory of that October morning lingered like the echo of gunfire, a reminder that sometimes ordinary people can rise and face down the legends who come to haunt them. The morning of October 5, 1892, would forever be etched into the bones of Coffeyville. The battle had ended, but its echoes lingered in smoke, blood, and stunned silence. The Dalton Gang, the men who had ridden into town with dreams of outlaw immortality, lay broken in the dirt, their ambitions torn apart by the courage of everyday people. Emmett's impossible survival. Among the fallen, one figure stirred. Emmett Dalton, just 21 years old, writhed in the dust, his body riddled with bullets. He had been shot more than 20 times, through the hips, arms, back, and side, each wound a mark of Coffeyville's fury. Townsfolk surrounded him cautiously, guns still trained. Surely no man could live through such punishment. But Emmett clung to life with a stubbornness that mirrored the Dalton name. His breaths came shallow, his eyes half closed, yet when a townsman rolled him over, he whispered hoarsely, "I'm still here." Doctors in Coffeyville were summoned immediately. With trembling hands, they worked to patch the torn young man, removing bullets, bandaging wounds, doing what they could with the tools of a frontier town. Against all odds, Emmett survived the night. The trial of the last Dalton survival did not mean freedom. Once he was strong enough, Emmett was put on trial for his part in the Coffeyville robberies. The evidence was undeniable. The people of the town themselves bore witness. He was sentenced to life in prison. At 21, Emmett Dalton began a new chapter behind iron bars, trading the dust of the outlaw trail for the stone and steel of a penitentiary. Years passed. The boy who had ridden beside his brothers aged into a man behind walls, but prison could not silence his memory of that day, nor the loss of Bob and Great. For all the bloodshed, Emmett alone carried the burden of remembrance. A path to redemption. After 14 years, Emmett Dalton was unexpectedly paroled. Some called it mercy, others said it was because his health was failing. Whatever the reason, he walked free into a changed America in 1907. No longer the reckless young outlaw, Emmett sought to carve a new life. He married, moved to California, and astonishingly, turned to writing. His memoirs, Beyond the Law and When the Daltons Rode, recounted the saga of his family's rise and fall. His words offered the world a glimpse inside the gang's fateful decisions, painting himself not as a hero, but as a man forever haunted. Hollywood came calling in the 1930s, adapting When the Daltons Rode into a film. Emmett even appeared briefly on screen, a grizzled reminder of the real outlaw days. In this strange twist of fate, the last Dalton lived long enough to see his family's story immortalized on the silver screen. He passed away in 1937 at the age of 66, far from the gunfire of Coffeyville, but never free of its shadow. The town that stood tall. For Coffeyville, the Dalton raid became both trauma and pride. 4 brave townsmen had died that day, defending their home against outlaw fire. Their names, Lucius Baldwin, George Cubine, Charles Brown, and Marshal Charles Connolly, were etched into memory as heroes. The town preserved its legacy. The banks, bullet-scarred and battered, stood as monuments. Visitors came to see where the last great outlaw raid of the Old West had been repelled not by lawmen, but by farmers, merchants, and mothers protecting their children. Coffeyville had shown the nation that the myth of the outlaw had limits, and that when pushed, ordinary citizens could become legends of their own. The legacy of the Dalton Gang. In the end, the Dalton Gang achieved the fame they sought, though not in the way they intended. Their names lived on not as victorious outlaws, but as cautionary figures, men who flew too close to the sun and fell in a hail of bullets. The tale of Coffeyville spread across newspapers, dime novels, and history books. It became a parable of hubris and community, of reckless ambition meeting immovable resistance. The Dalton Brothers had tried to outshine Jesse James and the Wild Bunch. Instead, they became symbols of the price of outlaw pride. Closing reflection picture, that October street one last time. The sun climbing higher, the smoke clearing, the bodies still. A town forever changed, a gang forever ended, and one young man, bleeding but alive, left to carry the story for the rest of his days. The Dalton Gang's final ride wasn't just about guns and greed. It was about the clash between myth and reality, between men chasing legends and a community unwilling to be their stage. And now, more than 130 years later, the echoes of Coffeyville still call to us. What do you think? Were the Daltons fearless dreamers chasing a place in history, or reckless fools blinded by ambition? If this story gripped you, don't let it end here. Hit that like button, share this video with a fellow history lover, and subscribe to our channel for more cinematic journeys into the legends and shadows of the Wild West. Your support keeps these stories alive, and together we'll keep riding into history.